Hi everyone. Just before we get started, is the presentation working for everyone? Can we all see what's going on? You should just be on a screen with a few photos rolling through. Okay, so I'll give us until just after 7 for people to join and then I'll get things started. For anyone who's just joined on, I'm just going to wait until after 7 and then I'll get things started just after that. Okay, well I think that might be long enough and I will kick us off now. Good evening everyone and welcome to the launch of the Yarra River Keeper Association's Wildlife Toolkit. I'm Tom Frawley and I'm the Stewardship Project Officer for the Yarra River Keeper Association. This is the second toolkit in a series of 3 focused on encouraging and informing engagement with the Yarra River and its surrounding landscape by us, the community that it supports. Before we move on, it is important that I, on behalf of the Yarra River Keeper Association, respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. As those joining us tonight are spread out across Victoria, we pay our respects to the entire Kulin Nation and to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of any other communities who may also be here tonight. So, similar to the launch of the Weeding Toolkit last month, this will only be a short presentation. We will take a look at why wildlife is important in ecosystems for maintaining positive function, then look into a little about the environment and ecosystem services which wildlife are pretty integral to. Additionally, I will also provide an introduction to the Wildlife Toolkit, as well as highlighting a couple of emergency response protocols for all of us to follow in the unfortunate event of coming across any injured wildlife. So, once again, I'll speak for about 10 minutes to these points, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. Also, after the Weeding Toolkit webinar, we had some feedback that slightly more time for questions may have been good, so I'll leave that period a little open-ended and we can see where we end up in terms of an appropriate time frame for that. Now, let's get cracking on some wildlife ecosystems and interactions chat. Good and complex ecosystems are good, and that those two things are pretty closely tied to each other. The importance of these two factors within the biosphere is something that is highlighted in the 9 planetary boundaries, which is a study that has come from the Stockholm Institute of Resilience. For anyone who is unfamiliar with this study, it is essentially a number of key factors or boundaries that are significant to our hopes of maintaining an environment which is more or less livable. Biodiversity is one of these boundaries, described as loss of biosphere integrity. Now, this need for biodiversity and complex ecological interactions within ecosystems is a concept that we also touched on in the Weeding Toolkit, but perhaps from a different perspective, given that weeds are plants and therefore generally occupy that first primary producer trophic level, drawing the sun's energy into the environment or ecosystem. Wildlife, on the other hand, fill more or less the rest of the spectrum in terms of the trophic levels, which are representative of where an organism sits within the food web based on where its energy comes from. At each progressive trophic level, only 10% of the energy is transferred to the next level. So it's easiest to imagine this as a pyramid, getting smaller as we move through the food web and up the trophic levels. So, without sufficient wildlife filling out each of these levels, there can't be sufficient energy flow from the bottom to the top of this pyramid. It's kind of a situation where biodiversity and resilience beget biodiversity and resilience. But when an ecosystem becomes unbalanced by poor biodiversity or biodiversity loss, they can be prone to a domino effect, where one outcome drives another which drives another, and each time deviating further from the natural state of the ecosystem and changing the ecological functions which are life-giving and life-supporting for so many animals, and are also so deeply entrenched in so much of our lives as humans as well. So, why is this a problem for the environment, and why is this a problem for people? Well, as we're all probably aware, the environment is in a state of flux, and this is often boiled down to the atmospheric CO2 levels being far too high, which, yes, this is a significant driving force of climate change, but we can't allow this one system to divert our attention away from other areas of significance, such as ecosystems, which not only regulate themselves when healthy, but also have a profound impact on the atmosphere, biosphere, and life in general. So, animals, wildlife, they play their part in ecology and regulation and ecosystem function and all these things that are great. But if we undermine the health of wildlife and biodiversity, then we're accidentally requiring ourselves to take control of all sorts of functions in ecosystems. And this is not only pertinent to ecosystems around the Yarra, but around the whole world. Some of these processes that wildlife drive are things that we know little about. However, we're only just starting to scratch the surface on why so many ecological functions carried out by wildlife are important and interrelated or even exist. This all leads to a situation where it becomes quite difficult to promote health in the environment and ecosystems if we're not supporting the natural stewards of the areas we're trying to protect. So in short, there's a level of respect that I think we as a society need to adopt for wildlife, not only as being representative of health and nature, but of actually being drivers, protectors and enhancers of health and nature. So how are people benefiting from the actions of wildlife? What is it that wildlife contributes to improving the world for our experience of it as humans? And this is something that I think the environmental sector as a whole struggles with a bit. The idea that people have a tendency towards anthropocentric ways of viewing things. And I don't think that it's worth talking down about, and I don't think it's something to feel guilty or conflicted about. I actually think that it's helpful at times to acknowledge how something impacts your own existence, because it draws your attention to it. And when you think of how people include wildlife in their lives, like an artist painting, a poet writing, or a scientist drawing inspiration from the natural world, well then I think it helps us to see this connection, and that can be quite helpful. Anyway, before I go on much further, let me just say, this is very broad. Wildlife is a very broad category. So, wildlife plays a large role in delivering ecosystem services. These are the many and varied benefits that humans receive from the environment, and we generally split them up into 4 categories, those being provision, regulation, support, and culture. These are all tangible categories that we can observe and that we can understand. Some more easily than others, such as a fish in and of itself being a service as it is a food source, compared to something like, say, the currently much maligned grey-headed flying fox, being a fantastic pollinator and seed disperser for many native plants, helping to build resilience and health in the environment. Also, just as a side note, the whole concept of ecosystem services is placing humans in the middle of it all, and is essentially the most anthropocentric way of looking at ecosystems as possible, but it's helpful. It helps us to understand how things work and where we fit into it all, which I think is a good thing. I think it's important, and I think feeling involved and a part of something helps us to create an interest in it. Now, let's discuss the toolkit and what it is for a minute or two before we go on any further, given this event is to introduce the toolkit itself. It is a small booklet that provides some information on things like wildlife and animals' relationships within ecosystems, and then, in light of the current state of biodiversity decline, not just in the Yarra catchment but globally, we've included some discussion on the most common method for assessing the conservation status of wildlife, the IUCN's Red List. But the real crux of the toolkit are the wildlife profiles. This was something that Anthony and I spent plenty of time thinking about in terms of what we wanted to include. We've ended up going with diet, distinguishing features, breeding season, habitat, native status, conservation status, and circadian rhythm. And then of course a photo to help with identification. And part of why we've decided to provide all of this information is because the toolkit specifically and exclusively encourages only observational engagement with wildlife. But we still wanted to be able to create this feeling of involvement, and thought that these attributes could create an understanding of an animal and how it lives, and this would allow people to feel like they understood the animals and help to build that sense of connectivity and awareness. There are 16 animals in the toolkit, which we decided would be a good number to begin with. And as with the weeding toolkit, there may be any number of expansions in the future, but we decided we'd put enough in that people would be likely to find a few of them, but not so many that the toolkit became more of an encyclopedia or field guide, as our intentions are really focused on creating engagement in a digestible and enjoyable way. So, just before I wrap it up, since we have spent some time talking about the great implications of having animals in their native habitats around the Yarra, I'll just touch briefly on what to do if you come across any injured wildlife. Wildlife Victoria provide a reporting service for people to call up on 13 000 94535. Calling this number and making a report is the best action that you can take for any injured animal. Short of this, you can also report online at Wildlife Victoria's website. And, unfortunately, even though we love them, domesticated animals, such as cats and dogs, can often cause harm to wildlife. So it's important for everyone to be conscious of this and keep their cats where they can see them and their dogs on leads unless they are in a designated off-lead area. I would also like to extend a quick thank you to Wildlife Victoria for their advice and input in making the Wildlife Toolkit. Now I'd just like to draw everyone's attention to this handy little online resource that the Yarra River Keeper Association manages. It's called the Yarra Catchment Atlas. It's a great resource for citizen science, and there is an easy process for anyone who wishes to submit a photo of something that they have found or seen along the Yarra to be added to the gallery. And once again, I'll just extend a quick thank you to CERDI and Federation University, RMIT, DELP, and all of the volunteers that have helped work on the Yarra Catchment Atlas. In addition to the Atlas, I'd also like to highlight this great app for your phone called iNaturalist. It's free, and it's basically a resource for people to take photos of things that they see, and this can be wildlife or it can be plants or any number of natural things whilst out for a walk. It's a fun app, I use it myself, and if you're ever looking to learn while you walk, it's another great resource. And of course, you're always welcome to send your discoveries and identifications to the Yarra Catchment Atlas if you like. Okay, thank you to everyone for attending tonight. Hopefully it's been an interesting last 10 to 15 minutes for you. And I'll now take any questions that anyone has thought of during the webinar and do my best to answer them for you. Jill Koppel. What about live data on when snakes are becoming active again seasonally? I don't actually know the answer to that. I will get back to you via email. I feel certain that Wildlife Victoria would have some good input into the best way to deal with that. Danielle Pullen, you said that grey-headed foxes are maligned. Why is this? Well, at the moment down in the Yarra Boulevard, there is a colony of them, which people are feeling a little bit nervous about. I think because of COVID, because they're bats. And there's been a bit of push against that and people trying to move them out of that area, which is unfortunate because it's pretty cool. Michelle Fisher, what is the catchment area you cover? Well, our aim is eventually to cover the entire Yarra catchment. So at the moment we have 4 sort of sites going that are mainly more metropolitan Melbourne, but over the journey the goal is definitely as much of the catchment area as possible. Kat McCready, did you work or consult with Aboriginal knowledge keepers? I personally haven't, but Andrew, who is the river keeper and head of the association, does. Quiet1_AU, is there a link for the Weeds Toolkit? Yes, I believe that's on our website, although we are currently making a new website, so there might be some weirdness going on in that space. Amy Sace, sorry if I got that wrong. What are your suggestions for keeping people engaged whilst they are staying at home? Good question. We're currently working on a little project with seed paper. So if you're a member of the association, or if you're just interested in this, Anthony has designed a really cool postcard which is made of seed paper, which you can plant in your backyard to try and rewild and include more native plants in people's backyards, which is, that's pretty fun. Marion Crook. I'm constantly chasing away the Indian miner and have seen them bully native birds. Any action to deal with them? Not that I am super aware of, other than just shooing them away, but I will get back to you via email after I have spoken to Wildlife Victoria, who may have a better idea of something you can do that will actively prevent Indian miners being in your space. Michelle Fisher. Have you noticed any increase/return of wildlife in the area since COVID-19 lockdowns started? I mean, I also work at a nursery and there was a wombat there one day, which was pretty cool. But I suppose I'm living in such a metropolitan area that I haven't particularly noticed too much of that myself. Helen Boak. Are you connecting with local councils? Yes. I have recently contacted Banyule as I am concerned at the development near the river on Rosehill Road and Fitzsimmons Road, Lower Plenty. Yep, we are in contact with local councils for the areas that we are doing projects in. Danielle Pullen. I've noticed a few new mountain bike tracks in Yarra Bend Park. How does the Yarra River Keepers Association feel about this? I'll speak off the cuff here, and I probably should say that this is my opinion and might not reflect the Yarra River Keeper Association, but I think spending time outside is good. There's obviously ways that, you can cause harm when on a bike going through generally sort of forested areas. So, good for people to be outside and creating that connection with the space. Maybe not so good if they're smashing through trees and wrecking stuff up, I suppose. Jill Koppel, those laminated A4 pages stuck up around the river, are they going to be more enduring interpretive plaques? I'm not entirely sure which pages you're talking about. I know that we, as an association, have talked about including some signage around the place, but I'm not sure that we have anything up as yet. Alright, well I might wrap it up there for tonight. We'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who attended, and we'll also be answering any further questions anyone might have via email. Good night, and hopefully I'll see you all again in a month for the launch of the third and final toolkit in our current engagement series, the Little Critters Toolkit, where we'll be learning a bit about bugs and their undeniable importance and fantastic contributions to the world around us. Good night.